This is Heliox, where evidence meets empathy. Independent, moderated, timely, deep, gentle, clinical, global, and community conversations about things that matter. Breathe easy, we go deep and lightly surface the big ideas.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to dig into something really important: the lasting impact of COVID-19 on children and adolescents.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic we need to understand better.
You've shared some really vital research, and we're going to explore what these studies tell us about both those initial infections and, well, the reinfections that seem increasingly common now.
Exactly. We have two key studies here that really help shed some light. First, there's one from Bavaria in Germany. It looked into the neurocognitive and emotional long-term effects after someone first got COVID-19.
Okay.
This was in a clinical setting, outpatients, and it focused specifically on 85 kids and teens, aged 12 to 17, who were having symptoms that just, weren't going away.
Persistent symptoms.
Right.
And the second source, that's the U.S. one.
Yeah, that one gives us a much broader view. It's the Recover AHR cohort study. It looked at the risk of PACE, that's post-acute sequelae of SARS-CoV-2 infection, basically the longer-term health issues after someone got reinfected during the Omicron wave.
Okay, PSC after reinfection.
And this study was huge. They looked at almost 500,000 people under 21. 465,717 to be exact.
Wow, that's a big data set.
It is. So our goal today really is to try and get a handle on the landscape of potential long-term challenges for young people after COVID.
Right.
We'll look at the key symptoms coming up, any risk factors the studies pointed to, and importantly, what the data says about getting infected again.
Okay, let's dive in then. Starting with that Bavarian study on the initial infections. What was their main focus exactly with those persistent symptoms?
So their main aim was to understand the full picture of what they called post-COVID syndrome in kids and teens whose symptoms lasted at least 4 weeks.
4 weeks, okay.
Yeah. And they wanted to look at both sides, the somatic, physical symptoms and the psychiatric, the mental health stuff. They weren't just describing it. They wanted to help figure out early interventions and maybe spot factors making some kids more vulnerable to these long-term neurocognitive or emotional problems.
So things like fatigue, stomach issues on one side, and maybe anxiety or mood changes on the other.
Precisely. Things like fatigue and abdominal pain would be somatic, while anxiety and mood fall under psychiatric.
Got it. And what were the symptoms these kids were reporting most often?
Well, fatigue was really dominant. Over 82% of them reported fatigue.
82%.
Yeah, huge. And close behind was loss of motivation. That was nearly 73%. Then difficulties with concentration and attention, just over 71%.
Those three sound incredibly disruptive for a young person's life.
Absolutely. And there was more. A worsened mood was reported by 53% and increased anxiety levels in almost 32%. Think about trying to navigate school, friendships, everything, feeling like that.
Definitely. It paints a really challenging picture. Did the study point to any specific medical diagnoses being common in this group?
Yes, they did. The most common one was post-COVID adjustment disorder. That affected close to 39%.
Adjustment disorder.
Yeah.
Like difficulty coping after the stress of the illness.
Kind of, yeah. It's about challenges adapting after a significant stressor. And the second most frequent was post-COVID attention deficit disorder, seen in just over 23%.
That lines up with the concentration issues they reported. Did the neuropsychiatric tests, the brain function tests, show anything specific?
They did. The main finding there was deficits in sustained attention.
Sustained attention, like trouble focusing for longer periods.
Exactly. They used computerized tests, which gave them a more objective measure of how well these young people could maintain focus over time.
And you mentioned the study linked physical and mental health symptoms.
Yes, that was a key finding. They found a statistically significant connection between having somatic physical post-COVID diagnoses and having psychiatric ones.
So they often go hand in hand.
It seems so. It really highlights that these aren't separate issues necessarily, but interconnected parts of the post-COVID syndrome in these kids. It shows how complex it can be.
Right. Were there any risk factors identified? Things that made some kids more likely to develop these problems?
They looked into that. One thing they found was that having allergies was associated with a higher risk of developing that post-COVID adjustment disorder.
Interesting. Allergy.
Yeah. And for the post-COVID attention deficit disorder, things like age, sex, obesity, having a psychiatric diagnosis before COVID, and even the virus variant. They all seemed relevant somehow.
Seemed relevant.
Well, it's interesting. In their statistical analysis, the regression analysis, no single one of those factors was strong enough on its own to be statistically significant.
Ah, okay. So maybe it's a combination of factors.
That's what it suggests, yeah. It's likely a more complex mix of these things contributing to the risk, not just one single cause.
Now, the introduction of that Bavarian study also mentioned other symptoms in earlier research, right?
hmm
It wasn't just fatigue and concentration issues.
Oh, definitely. They reviewed previous literature, and yeah, the list is pretty long. Things like headaches, abdominal pain, fatigue again, obviously, sleep problems, irritability, also respiratory issues, shortness of breath, losing taste or smell, mood problems, chest pain, muscle weakness. These came up a lot in various studies,
For quite a mix.
and some less common ones, too, highlighted elsewhere. Stomach aches, muscle pain, just described as colds, cough, poor appetite, weight loss, rashes, night sweats, fever, persistent breathing difficulty, dizziness. It really shows how differently long COVID can show up.
It really does. Did they compare symptoms in kids versus adults at all?
They did mention some data from German health insurance. It suggested some differences. For the younger group, things like malaise, just feeling generally unwell, tiredness, exhaustion, cough, and pain in the chest or neck seemed more common,
Okay.
whereas adults were more likely to report losing smell or taste, having a fever, and shortness of breath. But the general feeling from that data was also that kids and adolescents tended to do better overall, maybe recover faster than adults.
That's somewhat reassuring. The study also drew on research in adults for the emotional and neurocognitive side, even though their main focus was kids. What did that adult research suggest?
Right, acknowledging we need more kid-specific research, the adult studies point towards things like anxiety, depression, and PTSD as potential psychological issues after COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And in adults, it seems being female and having a tougher time during the pandemic overall might increase the risk for those psychological problems. There's also this link emerging in adults between inflammation in the body and neuropsychiatric symptoms post-COVID.
Like memory problems.
Yeah, exactly. Problems with attention, memory, executive functions, planning, organizing. And interestingly, some acute symptoms like headache or diarrhea during the initial illness were flagged as possible risk factors for later neuropsychiatric issues in adults.
Okay, and going back to studies on kids mentioned in the Bavarian paper's background, any consistent findings there?
Well, they mentioned a meta-analysis, where they combine results from multiple studies.
Right.
That suggested kids post-COVID had a higher risk for cognitive deficits, headaches, and dysosmia. That's the distorted sense of smell compared to kids who hadn't had COVID.
But not other common symptoms like fatigue or cough in that analysis.
Apparently not significantly different in that specific meta-analysis for things like stomach aches, cough, fatigue, muscle pain, sleep issues, fever, dizziness, etc. The authors did note a trend, though. The higher the quality of the study they looked at, the lower the reported rate of symptoms seemed to be.
Interesting caveat.
Yeah. And other research mentioned hinted at a possible link between COVID and PANS pediatric acute onset neuropsychiatric syndrome.
PANS.
Yeah, it can show up as things like OCD or really restricted eating. Plus, other studies using those detailed neuropsychological tests found deficits in kids post-COVID across a range of areas: verbal thinking, attention, working memory, visual processing, even sense of movement, and nonverbal thinking, too. It's quite a spectrum.
It sounds incredibly complex, and the Bavarian study itself, their approach sounds like they tried to cover a lot of bases. How did they actually design it?
Yeah, they really aimed for a thorough look. They combined methods, somatic and psychiatric diagnostics. So, detailed interviews about the COVID infection itself, full psychological assessments, and then a whole battery of neuropsychological tests.
The computerized ones for attention.
Those, yes, for an objective measure, but also questionnaires filled out by both the kids and their parents. The main goal was really to see if the risk factors people had talked about, often based on adult studies, held true for the cognitive and emotional symptoms they were seeing in these kids and teens.
Okay, that gives us a really solid grounding in what that Bavarian study found about initial infections. Let's shift gears now to the Recover AHR study and this issue of reinfection, particularly during Omicron. What was the main question they were asking?
So the Recover study zeroed in on the risk of getting PPSC, those longer-term problems, specifically after someone under 21 got reinfected with COVID during the Omicron period.
Right, the Omicron wave.
They wanted to know, does getting it a second time during that period bring extra risks for long-term issues in kids and adolescents?
And you said this was the really big one, the sample size.
Massive, yeah. 465,717 people under 21. And the time frame was January 2022 to October 2023, which really covers that Omicron dominance period. That size gives their findings a lot of statistical weight.
Definitely. How did they define reinfection? Like how soon after the first one?
Good question. They defined it as a second confirmed infection, so a positive test or a diagnosis that happened at least 60 days after the first one.
60 days. Okay. To make sure it wasn't just lingering virus.
Exactly. To be reasonably sure it was a distinct new infection.
So the million-dollar question, what did they find comparing PSC risk after reinfection versus the first infection?
Well, the key finding was pretty stark. They found a statistically significant increased risk of an overall PSC diagnosis after reinfection.
Increased risk? How much?
The relative risk was 2.08.
2.08, so more than double the risk.
Essentially, yes. Your risk of getting diagnosed with some kind of PSC was more than twice as high after that second infection compared to just having the first one.
Wow. Okay, that's a major finding. Were there specific conditions, specific types of PSC that showed a particularly high risk after reinfection?
Yes, they broke it down, and several specific conditions showed significantly increased risks. It's quite a list, actually.
Okay, let's hear it.
Myocarditis, the heart muscle inflammation, had a relative risk of 3.60.
3.5 times the risk, roughly.
Yeah.
That's concerning.
Yeah, especially in young people. Changes in taste and smell, relative risk 2.83. Blood clot issues, thrombophlebitis and thromboembolism, RR 2.28. Heart disease generally, 1.96. Acute kidney injury, 1.90.
Kidney injury, too.
Yeah. Fluid and electrolyte problems, 1.89. Generalized pain, 1.70. Arrhythmias, irregular heartbeats, 1.59. Abnormal liver enzymes, 1.56.
Okay, it's hitting multiple systems.
Definitely. Even things like fatigue and malaise showed an increased risk, RR 1.50. Musculoskeletal pain, 1.45. Abdominal pain, 1.42. POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and related dysautonomia issues, 1.35.
POTS is one we hear about quite a bit with long COVID.
It is. And even cognitive functions showed a slightly increased risk, 1.32, and general respiratory signs and symptoms, 1.29.
So it really wasn't just one or two things spiking, it was broad.
Exactly. The researchers really stressed that these increased risks after reinfection were seen across many different organ systems: cardiovascular, respiratory, gut, neurological, musculoskeletal, you name it.
Highlighting a really wide-ranging potential impact from getting infected again.
Precisely.
What was the main conclusion the Recover study authors drew from all this?
Their big takeaway was about cumulative risk. They basically said that repeated infections seem to add up in terms of payday C risk.
Right.
And because of that, they stressed an urgent need for prevention strategies, ways to cut down on these reinfections, and they specifically pointed to vaccination as a really crucial tool for preventing infections and reinfections in kids and adolescents.
Okay, so let's try and connect the dots here between the Bavarian study on initial infection and this Recover study on reinfection. How do they fit together in understanding the bigger picture for young people?
Well, it's interesting. They really do complement each other, don't they?
Yeah, it seems like it.
The Bavarian study gives us that detailed, almost granular view of the neurocognitive and emotional challenges that can pop up after just one infection, especially if symptoms linger. It helps us see the types of issues and maybe some contributing factors. Then the Recover study zooms out, uses that huge data set and shows us, okay, even with Omicron, getting it again isn't necessarily milder in the long run. It carries this added significant risk for a whole bunch of different conditions across the body.
And that link the Bavarian study found between physical and mental symptoms being interconnected. Does the Recover data support that idea, even indirectly?
I think it does, in a way. Recover focused on specific medical diagnoses, right? But the sheer breadth of systems affected heart, kidney, neurological, pain, fatigue, even cognitive function. It reinforces this idea that COVID's effects aren't siloed. So while Bavaria directly showed the somatic psychiatric link, Recover's findings of multi-system impact after reinfection certainly resonate with that interconnectedness. It suggests the hits can come from many angles, physically and maybe cognitively too.
The Bavarian team talked about needing multidisciplinary approaches for diagnosis and treatment after that initial infection. This seems even more relevant now, looking at both studies.
Absolutely. The complexity just shouts for it, doesn't it? If a kid has lingering fatigue, brain fog, maybe some new heart palpitations or gut issues after one or two bouts of COVID,
Yeah.
you can't just send them to one specialist and expect a full picture. The Bavarian call for involving both physical and mental health experts feels spot on. You need that holistic view to manage these potentially complex multi-system conditions effectively.
And Recover's big push for prevention, especially vaccination, to cut down reinfections. How does that relate back to the Bavarian findings about the initial problems?
Well, it's the logical next step, isn't it? Recover shows reinfection adds risk. So preventing those reinfections becomes paramount to reducing the overall burden of PIAC.
Makes sense.
So while Bavaria helps us understand the problems that can arise from the first hit, Recover gives a strong reason to try and prevent subsequent hits. If we can lower infections and reinfections through things like vaccination, hopefully we lessen the number of kids dealing with the initial issues and avoid that added layer of risk Recover identified. It becomes a key strategy for protecting long-term health.
Okay, so let's try and boil this down. For everyone listening, what are the most crucial takeaways from this deep dive into these two studies on long COVID in kids and teens?
I think there are two main points to really grasp. First, from the Bavarian study, we see that an initial COVID infection absolutely can lead to persistent neurocognitive and emotional problems in some children and adolescents.
Right, the fatigue, motivation, concentration issues.
Exactly. Fatigue, loss of motivation, attention problems, mood changes, anxiety. These were common, sometimes leading to diagnoses like adjustment disorder or attention deficit disorder. That's real and impactful.
Okay, takeaway number one.
Takeaway number two comes from Recover. Getting reinfected, at least during the Omicron era they studied, significantly bumps up the risk of developing a wide array of post-acute problems affecting multiple organs.
The double overall PSC risk, the myocarditis,
Yeah.
kidney issues, cognitive function.
Yes, all of that. It strongly suggests that the risk of these longer-term health consequences isn't a one-and-done thing. It can actually build up with repeated infections.
Okay, really important points. And finally, something to leave our listeners thinking about.
Yeah, maybe a final thought to chew on. Given what these studies suggest, both the initial potential impacts and the added risk from reinfection, what does this mean for the long-term health trajectory of this generation? And flowing from that, what kind of research do we most critically need now? And what public health actions should we be considering as we continue to grapple with this virus and its lingering effects?
It's clear there's still a lot to learn, right?
Definitely. Our understanding is absolutely still evolving, but studies like these give us really valuable, if sometimes concerning, pieces of the puzzle about the potential lasting consequences for young people.
Thanks for listening today. 4 recurring narratives underlie every episode: boundary dissolution, adaptive complexity, embodied knowledge, and quantum-like uncertainty. These aren't just philosophical musings, but frameworks for understanding our modern world. We hope you continue exploring our other podcasts, responding to the content, and checking out our related articles at helioxpodcast.substack.com.